Welcome to another chapter in our exploration of America's darkest historical mysteries. Before we begin this disturbing account, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and what time you heard the story. We're documenting how these forgotten horrors reach audiences across the world. The Sullivan case of 1834 remains one of the most horrifying discoveries in Virginia history. It begins with a simple, terrible fact. On November 3, 1834, authorities discovered 47 children imprisoned in the basement of the Sullivan family estate in Blackwood County, Virginia. What makes this case particularly disturbing isn't just the discovery itself, but the decades of silence that preceded it, and the web of complicity that allowed such horror to continue unnoticed. The Sullivan family had been prominent members of Blackwood County society since the 1780s. Marcus Sullivan, 56, inherited the family estate in 1808, a sprawling property of over 300 acres with a main house, several outbuildings, and extensive tobacco fields. County records show he married Eleanor Ashworth, 52, in 1810. The couple had no children of their own, a fact that would later take on sinister significance. The estate employed a small staff and maintained cordial, if distant, relations with neighboring families. The Sullivans were known for their reclusiveness, rarely attending social functions despite their wealth and status. This isolation was attributed to Eleanor's reportedly fragile health and Marcus's preference for privacy, traits not uncommon among wealthy landowners of the era. What distinguished the Sullivan property from others was its unusual architecture. In 1815, Marcus undertook extensive renovations to the main house, including the construction of what he described to contractors as an expanded root cellar and storage facility beneath the house. Building permits from Blackwood County archives show the underground structure was far larger than typical for the period, approximately 2,000 square feet divided into multiple chambers. Workers who participated in the construction later testified to peculiar design elements: reinforced iron doors, unusually thick walls, and ventilation shafts that were carefully concealed. One mason, Thomas Garrett, reported in his personal journal that Sullivan had been particular about soundproofing and had paid extra to ensure the basement rooms were isolated from the rest of the house. At the time, these requests seemed merely eccentric. For nearly 2 decades, the Sullivan estate operated without arousing significant suspicion. However, several incidents that seemed innocuous at the time would later be re-examined as missed warnings. In 1822, a neighboring farmer named Jacob Morrison reported seeing children's faces in the small, ground-level windows of the Sullivan basement late one evening. When he inquired the next day, Eleanor Sullivan explained they were hosting several orphan children from relatives, teaching them household skills before finding them permanent situations. This explanation satisfied Morrison, particularly as such arrangements were not uncommon among wealthy families of the period. Between 1823 and 1833, at least a dozen separate accounts exist of people hearing children's voices or crying coming from the Sullivan property. Most dismissed these sounds as echoes from neighboring farms or the imagination. One instance, however, was more difficult to explain. In August 1828, Reverend Samuel Pierce visited the estate to discuss a church donation. In his diary, later submitted as evidence, Pierce described hearing what he termed a chorus of young voices singing hymns emanating from beneath his feet while in the Sullivan parlor. When he remarked upon it, Marcus Sullivan claimed the sounds came from workers' children playing near the house. Pierce noted that the explanation seemed plausible at the time, though he privately recorded feeling unsettled by the visit. Perhaps most damning were reports from merchants in the nearby town of Millbrook. Between 1820 and 1834, the Sullivans purchased extraordinary quantities of certain supplies: children's clothing in various sizes, basic foodstuffs in bulk, medical supplies including bandages and salves, and locks, dozens of heavy iron locks. Sarah Whitmore, who operated the general store, testified that she had thought it unusual but assumed the Sullivans were engaged in some charitable work with orphans or poor children from the region. They were gentry, she later stated. One didn't question the gentry about their business, particularly when they paid in gold and never haggled over prices. The horror of the Sullivan basement came to light through tragic circumstances. On October 28, 1834, a fire broke out in one of the estate's tobacco barns. Neighbors and townspeople rushed to help contain the blaze. During the commotion, a young boy, later identified as Daniel, age approximately 12, emerged from a concealed entrance near the main house's foundation. According to multiple witness statements collected by Sheriff William Crawford, the boy was emaciated, dressed in rags, and appeared terrified of the sunlight. He collapsed within yards of the door. When neighbors tried to help him, he spoke in broken, barely coherent English, repeatedly saying "the others" and "still below." Dr. Henry Morrison, who had responded to tend any injuries from the fire, examined the boy and immediately recognized signs of severe malnutrition, old fractures that had healed improperly, and scarring consistent with prolonged restraint. Most disturbing were marks around the boy's ankles, deep grooves where manacles had worn away the skin over what appeared to be years. Sheriff Crawford, accompanied by Dr. Morrison and 6 townsmen, forced entry into the Sullivan basement despite Marcus Sullivan's vehement protests. What they found would haunt every man present for the rest of his life. Sheriff Crawford's official report, preserved in the Virginia State Archives, provides a chilling inventory of what was discovered. The basement consisted of 6 large chambers connected by narrow passages. Each chamber contained between 6 and 10 children, ages ranging from approximately 5 to 16 years old. A total of 47 children were found alive. 3 small graves in a sealed alcove suggested others had not survived. The children were kept in conditions that defied comprehension. Most were chained by ankle irons to iron rings embedded in the stone walls, with chains approximately 6 feet in length, enough to allow movement within a small area but not escape. Straw mattresses served as bedding. A single bucket in each chamber served sanitary needs. Ventilation came from small, barred shafts that reached the surface but were too narrow for escape. The children were dressed uniformly in rough homespun clothing. Many bore signs of malnutrition, though Dr. Morrison noted they appeared to have been fed regularly, just barely enough to sustain life. Medical examination revealed a catalog of horrors: untreated injuries, scarring from restraints, evidence of long-term confinement, and in several cases, brands or marks that seemed to serve as identification. Most disturbing was the children's behavior. Many didn't react to their rescuer's presence. Several cowered in corners. Some spoke only in whispers if they spoke at all. A few sang hymns or recited Bible verses mechanically, as if by rote. They appeared to have been systematically broken, reduced to shadows of children rather than children themselves. In one chamber, Crawford discovered what appeared to be a crude schoolroom. Slates and chalk were arranged on a rough table. Basic reading primers were stacked against the wall. The walls themselves bore children's drawings, hundreds of them, scratched into the stone or drawn in what appeared to be charcoal. Many depicted the same scene: a house above, darkness below, and small figures with chains. Marcus and Eleanor Sullivan were immediately taken into custody. Their initial response was silence, complete, unyielding silence. Eleanor Sullivan reportedly fainted upon arrest and remained in a semi-catatonic state throughout the subsequent investigation. Marcus Sullivan, however, eventually provided a statement that was recorded by the county prosecutor. According to Sullivan's account, the children were orphans, foundlings, and unwanted children he had saved from certain death or worse fates. He claimed he was providing them shelter, food, and Christian education. The chains, he insisted, were necessary to prevent them from running away before they were civilized and fit for society. When asked why he had never reported these children to authorities or sought proper orphanages for their care, Sullivan claimed he was acting on higher guidance, that God had called him to save these lost souls through discipline and isolation. He maintained that his methods, while harsh, were necessary for the children's spiritual salvation. This explanation satisfied no one. Further investigation revealed a more sinister reality. As the children slowly began to speak, a process that took weeks or months for many, a horrifying picture emerged. The children had come from various sources over nearly 20 years. Some had been purchased from desperate parents. Others were orphans taken from poorhouses and hospitals, their disappearances unreported or attributed to disease and death. A few had been kidnapped from neighboring counties or even other states. Most chilling were accounts from older children who had been in the basement for years. They described a rigid system of control. Obedience earned basic necessities. Defiance brought punishment ranging from isolation to starvation. The Sullivans visited the basement daily, conducting religious instruction that was more indoctrination than education. Children were taught they were sinful, that the outside world was evil, that their confinement was divine punishment and opportunity for redemption. Eleanor Sullivan, despite her fragile appearance, had been deeply involved. Several children described her as the teacher, conducting daily lessons in reading, writing, and scripture. But they also described her cruelty, her willingness to withhold food, her cold indifference to their suffering, her insistence that their pain was purifying. The system had its own terrible logic. As children grew older and proved obedient, they were given small privileges, better food, more freedom within the basement, and eventually, for a few, limited supervised access to above ground. Some of the oldest children had helped care for younger ones, creating a hierarchy of victims who perpetuated their own captivity. Most disturbing were accounts of children who had aged out of the system. At least a dozen older teenagers, upon reaching approximately 16 years of age, had been released, given new identities, minimal funds, and sent to distant locations with instructions never to speak of their past. Some had been placed with Sullivan's business associates as indentured servants. Others simply disappeared into the population, traumatized and conditioned to silence. Investigators attempted to track these released children but found the task nearly impossible. In the 1830s, with limited record-keeping and easy movement between states, individuals could vanish without trace. A few former captives were eventually located. Their testimonies confirmed the horror but also revealed the lasting psychological damage. Many were unable to form normal relationships, struggled with paranoia and depression, or had developed such ingrained submissiveness that they seemed incapable of independent thought. As the investigation deepened, evidence emerged of a broader network of complicity. The Sullivans had not acted entirely alone. Several business associates and even a county official had been aware, to varying degrees, of the basement operation. Jonathan Blackwell, a lawyer who handled Sullivan's financial affairs, admitted under questioning that he had suspected something amiss but had never investigated. Records showed he had helped Sullivan acquire children from orphanages in 3 different states, using legal paperwork that purported to establish foster arrangements but contained forged signatures and false information. A doctor, Robert Chenoweth, had occasionally treated children in the basement for serious illnesses or injuries, always under conditions of strict secrecy. He claimed Sullivan had convinced him the children were being protected from their own violent tendencies and that the arrangement was approved by family courts. Chenoweth's medical records revealed he had treated at least 15 different children over 8 years, yet never reported the conditions he witnessed. Most shocking was the involvement of County Commissioner Albert Thornton, who had received substantial bribes from Sullivan to overlook irregularities in property taxes and building permits. While Thornton claimed ignorance of the children's existence, correspondence discovered in his files suggested he had known something was amiss at the Sullivan estate, but had chosen to ignore it in exchange for financial benefit. This web of enablers, some active participants, others willfully blind, revealed how such horror could persist for years. In a hierarchical society where questioning the wealthy was uncommon, where children's welfare was not systematically monitored, and where corruption could purchase silence, the Sullivan basement had operated as an open secret that no one chose to investigate. The trial of Marcus and Eleanor Sullivan began in March 1835 and lasted 6 weeks. It was one of the most sensational criminal proceedings in Virginia history, drawing spectators from across the state and coverage in newspapers as far north as Boston and as far south as Charleston. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence: testimony from rescued children, witness accounts of suspicious activities, physical evidence from the basement, and documentation of the Sullivans' acquisition of children through fraudulent means. Dr. Morrison provided expert testimony about the physical abuse and neglect the children had endured. The foreman who had helped build the basement testified about Sullivan's specific requests for soundproofing and reinforced restraints. The defense attempted to portray Marcus Sullivan as a misguided religious zealot acting from benevolent if misapplied motives. They argued he had genuinely believed he was saving children from lives of poverty and sin. Eleanor Sullivan's attorney painted her as a dominated wife, acting under her husband's influence and suffering from her own mental instabilities. Neither argument proved persuasive. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on multiple counts of kidnapping, false imprisonment, and child cruelty. The death penalty was mandated for crimes of such magnitude. Jonathan Blackwell and Dr. Chenoweth received prison sentences, 10 and 7 years respectively. County Commissioner Thornton, facing charges of bribery and official misconduct, took his own life before trial. Marcus and Eleanor Sullivan were hanged on August 12, 1835, before a crowd estimated at over 2,000 people. Contemporary newspaper accounts described the scene in detail, the largest public execution in Blackwood County history. Marcus Sullivan maintained his silence to the end, refusing to offer any final statement. Eleanor Sullivan, who had remained largely catatonic throughout the trial, reportedly spoke briefly before the sentence was carried out. According to multiple witnesses, she said only, "We saved them from worse. God will judge." This final statement sparked outrage and debate. What worse fate could she have imagined than years of imprisonment, malnutrition, and systematic psychological torture? Some interpreted her words as delusion, the rationalization of a disturbed mind. Others saw calculated cruelty, a final attempt to justify the unjustifiable. The rescued children faced an uncertain future. In 1834, systems for dealing with such trauma barely existed. Many of the younger children, particularly those who had been in captivity for most of their lives, had no memory of any other existence. They knew no families, had no identities beyond what the Sullivans had assigned them, and were utterly unprepared for life in normal society. Churches and charitable organizations throughout Virginia took responsibility for the children's care. Most were placed in orphanages or with foster families. Medical treatment addressed their physical ailments, but the psychological damage proved more persistent. Records show that approximately half of the rescued children were eventually reunited with families who had been searching for missing sons or daughters. These reunions were often bittersweet. Children who couldn't remember their parents, families shocked by the transformation trauma had wrought. Others remained in institutional care throughout their childhoods. A few of the older teenagers, those who had spent most of their lives in the basement, never fully adjusted to freedom. At least 3 took their own lives in the years following rescue. Several others spent time in asylums, unable to cope with the trauma they had endured. Some, however, survived and even thrived. Records indicate that at least 15 of the Sullivan children went on to live relatively normal lives, marrying, having families, establishing businesses or farms. They rarely spoke of their experiences, preferring to bury that chapter of their lives as deeply as they had once been buried beneath the Sullivan house. One survivor, a woman identified in records only as MS, who had been rescued at age 14, wrote a memoir in 1867. Published anonymously as From Darkness into Light, A Captive's Tale, it provided one of the few first-hand accounts of life in the Sullivan basement. She described the daily routine of fear, the grinding hunger, the psychological manipulation, and the strange community that formed among the children, both supportive and, at times, cruelly hierarchical as they competed for small mercies. MS's memoir also revealed something that had been less emphasized during the trial. The children had not been entirely passive victims. They had developed their own secret language of whispers and gestures. They had hidden small tokens and treasures. They had told stories to younger children to help them endure. In some small way, they had maintained their humanity even in inhuman conditions. The Sullivan estate was seized by the county and stood vacant for several years. No one wanted to purchase property associated with such evil. In 1839, the main house was demolished by order of the county. The basement, that chamber of horrors, was filled with stones and sealed. Local legend claims the demolition crew refused to work alone, that several workers reported hearing children's voices emanating from the sealed basement even after it was filled. One foreman allegedly quit midway through the job, claiming he had seen small handprints on the basement walls that appeared fresh, despite the children having been rescued years earlier. Whether these accounts represent genuine supernatural phenomena or the psychological weight of knowing what had occurred there remains a matter of debate. What is certain is that the land where the Sullivan house once stood was never developed again. Today, the location is part of Blackwood State Forest. A small historical marker, erected in 1984 on the 150th anniversary of the rescue, notes only, Site of the Sullivan Estate, 1808 to 1839, in memory of the children imprisoned here and the community that failed to protect them. The Sullivan case had far-reaching effects on Virginia law and society. In 1836, the state legislature passed the Child Protection Act, one of the first laws in America mandating regular inspection of institutions housing children and requiring documentation of all child placements. While imperfect and often poorly enforced, it represented an acknowledgement that children needed systematic protection beyond what ad hoc charity provided. The case also sparked national debate about child welfare, the limits of parental or custodial authority, and the responsibility of communities to intervene when abuse is suspected. Newspaper editorials from the period reveal intense soul-searching. How could such horror exist unnoticed? What did it say about society that dozens of children could be imprisoned for years while neighbors and authorities remained willfully blind? Some blamed the era's rigid class structure, the reluctance of common people to question the wealthy. Others pointed to inadequate laws and systems for tracking orphaned or displaced children. Religious leaders debated whether the Sullivans' perverted Christianity indicated deeper problems with how faith was practiced and understood. A few voices, particularly in abolitionist circles, drew uncomfortable parallels between the Sullivan basement and the institution of slavery. If children could be held in chains, subjected to forced labor and psychological control, how was this fundamentally different from the bondage endured by millions of enslaved people? This comparison was controversial but helped fuel growing moral opposition to slavery in the North. Despite extensive investigation, certain aspects of the Sullivan case remain unclear. The exact number of children who passed through the basement is unknown. The 3 graves found suggested at least some children died in captivity, but exhumation and examination were limited by the medical science of the time. Did others die? Were there more graves elsewhere on the property? The fate of children released before the discovery remains largely untraced. If a dozen teenagers were sent away over the years, what became of them? Some were located, but others vanished into history. Did they start new lives, free of their past? Did they carry trauma that shaped their futures? Did some perpetuate cycles of abuse, having known nothing else? Most troubling, was the Sullivan basement unique, or were there other such places? In an era of limited record-keeping and communication, could similar horrors have existed elsewhere, undiscovered? Some historians believe the Sullivan case was exceptional only in being discovered and prosecuted, that child abuse, trafficking, and exploitation were far more common than historical records suggest, hidden by social structures that valued privacy and hierarchy over protection of the vulnerable. The Sullivan case resonates uncomfortably with modern understanding of institutional abuse, human trafficking, and the long-term effects of childhood trauma. While the specific circumstances were products of their time, the underlying patterns, predators using authority and isolation to control victims, systems that fail to protect the vulnerable, communities that see but don't intervene, remain tragically familiar. Psychologists who have studied historical accounts of the Sullivan children note patterns consistent with what we now call complex trauma. Dissociation, learned helplessness, difficulty forming attachments, and perpetuation of abuse. The children's adaptation to captivity, their internal hierarchies, their acceptance of their situation, their inability to escape even when opportunities arose, mirrors behaviors observed in modern survivors of long-term captivity and abuse. The network of enablers around the Sullivans also offers disturbing lessons. The lawyer who looked away, the doctor who treated but didn't report, the official who accepted bribes, each represents a choice to prioritize personal comfort or gain over children's welfare. Their involvement illustrates that great evil often requires not just perpetrators but a supporting cast of those who collaborate, rationalize, or simply decline to act. In 2009, a group of historians and descendants of the rescued children commissioned a memorial near the site of the Sullivan estate. Unlike the stark historical marker, This memorial lists the names of the 47 rescued children, or rather, the names they were known by, as many of their birth names were never recovered. The memorial includes space for the 3 children buried in the basement, represented by blank plaques. Unknown, unidentified, but not forgotten. And it includes a 4th blank space, representing all other victims of child abuse, then and now, who remain uncounted and unnamed. Each year on November 3rd, the anniversary of the discovery, a small ceremony is held at the memorial. Survivors of child abuse and their advocates gather to remember the Sullivan children and to recommit to protecting vulnerable children today. It's a quiet observance, attended mostly by locals and those with personal connections to child welfare work. Those who attend often speak of feeling a particular weight in that place, standing where such horror occurred. Some describe it as a reminder of the worst humans are capable of. Others frame it as testament to human resilience, that 47 children survived, and many eventually thrived, despite years of unimaginable cruelty. The Sullivan case stands as one of the darkest chapters in Virginia history, a systematic, sustained horror perpetrated against the most vulnerable, enabled by a society that valued propriety over protection, that trusted authority without question, that looked away rather than confront uncomfortable truths. Yet it also represents a turning point. The public revulsion, the legal reforms, the painful self-examination it prompted. These represented a society beginning to acknowledge its responsibility to protect children, to see them not as property or problems, but as individuals deserving safety and care. The children of the Sullivan basement endured hell and emerged into a world that was finally, belatedly, ready to acknowledge their suffering and seek justice. Their ordeal was not in vain if it taught lessons about vigilance, about moral courage, about the necessity of intervening when we witness harm. As one survivor reportedly said late in life, "I spent my childhood in chains. I spent my adulthood ensuring no other child would endure what I endured. That was my freedom. Not just escaping those walls, but tearing down all walls that imprison children." The Sullivan basement is sealed. The house is gone. The perpetrators long dead. But the story remains, a ghost story in the truest sense. Not of supernatural hauntings but of past horrors that haunt our collective conscience, demanding we do better, that we protect those who cannot protect themselves, that we never look away when children are in danger. Because in the end, what distinguished the Sullivan case was not the evil of 2 individuals, but the failure of an entire community. And that is a failure we must guard against, generation after generation, ensuring the darkness of 1834 never finds fertile ground again. The Sullivan case reminds us that evil thrives not just through malicious action but through the indifference and complicity of those who could have intervened but chose silence. May we never be silent again.